Imagine a world where the fate of a nation rested on the shoulders of a handful of men, driven by a relentless faith and an insatiable hunger for wealth. This was the world of the Dutch Republic in the early 1600s, a small country that would soon become a global powerhouse. At the heart of this transformation was a group of merchants and adventurers who set sail into the unknown, driven by a mission that was as much about spreading their faith as it was about securing their fortune. In the late 1500s, the Dutch were a people in turmoil. They had just thrown off the yoke of Spanish rule and were fighting for their independence. But their struggle wasn't just political. It was also religious. The Dutch had embraced Calvinism, a strict form of Protestantism that emphasized the sovereignty of God and the predestination of souls. This faith gave them a sense of purpose and unity, but it also fueled a deep desire to spread their beliefs to the far corners of the world. On April 2nd, 1595, a flotilla of 4 ships set sail from the bustling port of Amsterdam. Led by the ambitious and often arrogant Cornelis de Houtman, the fleet was bound for the East Indies, a distant and exotic land known for its spices, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. These spices were worth their weight in gold and could make the Dutch rich beyond their wildest dreams. But the journey was fraught with danger. The ships were small, the seas were treacherous, and the crew was inexperienced. The voyage was a disaster. De Houtman's arrogance and poor leadership led to conflict with local rulers and merchants in the East Indies. Disease ravaged the crew, and by the time the ships limped back to the Netherlands in 1597, most of the men were dead. De Houtman himself barely escaped with his life. Yet, despite this tragic outcome, the voyage proved that the East Indies were within reach. The idea of a Dutch commercial empire began to take shape. In 1602, the United East India Company, VOC, was formed, and just over 20 years later, in 1621, the West India Company, WIC, followed. These companies were more than just trading organizations. They were instruments of Dutch power and faith. The VOC and WIC were granted monopolies by the Dutch government to trade, establish colonies, and even wage war in the name of the Republic. But they were also tasked with spreading Calvinism, a mission that was as important as the pursuit of profit. The Dutch Republic, with Amsterdam at its heart, quickly became a hub of international trade and finance. The city's harbor was a bustling scene, with ships from all over the world docking to unload their goods. Tobacco, sugar, spices, and silk filled the markets and shops, while the smell of nutmeg and pepper wafted through the streets. The great canal district, with its magnificent homes, was a testament to the wealth and power of the merchants and financiers who had made the Dutch Republic a global force. But the success of the Dutch Empire was not just about wealth. It was also about faith. The Calvinist ministers, or predicanten, who accompanied the VOC and WIC ships, were determined to convert the pagans and Moors they encountered. They saw their mission as a divine calling, a way to bring the light of Christianity to the dark corners of the world. This mission was not always straightforward. The predicanten faced resistance, misunderstanding, and sometimes outright hostility from the people they sought to convert. But they persisted, driven by a belief that their faith was the only true path to salvation. The Dutch Empire was a complex tapestry of commerce, faith, and power. It was a world where the pursuit of wealth and the spread of religion went hand in hand, where the dreams of a small nation became a global reality. And at the center of it all was a city that would come to symbolize the height of Dutch ambition and achievement: Amsterdam. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century was a hub of global connections. While Amsterdam often gets the most attention, many other cities in the Netherlands played crucial roles in this network. Trading companies like the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the Dutch West India Company, WIC, had offices or chambers in cities like Middelburg, Delft, Hoorn, Rotterdam, and Enkhuizen. These chambers managed local trade and logistics, ensuring that goods from around the world could reach Dutch markets. In these cities, you could see the impact of global trade everywhere. Company warehouses lined the outskirts, storing exotic goods like spices, textiles, and porcelain. In the city centers, office buildings displayed company flags, a proud symbol of their reach and power. For example, in Leiden, botanist Carolus Clusius created a botanical garden long before the one in Amsterdam. He worked with VOC officials to bring plants from Asia and Africa, turning the garden into a living museum of the world's flora. In Delft, artisans crafted blue Delftware, a style inspired by the Chinese porcelain that flooded the Netherlands in the 17th century. This beautiful pottery became a symbol of Dutch craftsmanship and a global connection. Private collectors throughout the Netherlands assembled cabinets of curiosities filled with exotic plants, animals, and objects brought back by VOC and WIC personnel. These collections were like mini-museums, touting the wonders of the world. Dutch cities were vibrant marketplaces where people could buy goods from all over the globe. In city squares in Middelburg, Delft, Haarlem, Utrecht, and Groningen, merchants sold silk from China, tulip bulbs from Anatolia, coffee from the Middle East, tobacco from the East Indies and Ceylon. Netherlanders could wear silk, plant tulips, drink coffee, smoke tobacco, and use spices from distant lands, making their daily lives a blend of local and global influences. But it wasn't just goods that traveled. Muse and stories from around the world also captured the imagination of the Dutch. Jan Huygen van Linkschoten, who sailed to Asia with the Portuguese, wrote detailed accounts of his travels, including maps and descriptions of sea routes. His book, Itinerario, published in 1596, sparked curiosity and excitement. Other explorers, like Cornelis de Houtman, wrote about their adventures in the Indies, and these stories were translated into multiple languages, spreading the tales far and wide. The Dutch Republic was a major center for book publishing. By 1650, there were 247 publishing operations in 34 cities, with Amsterdam leading the way with 91 firms. Dutch publishers produced over 100,000 titles in the 1600s, many of which were travel accounts and descriptions of far-off lands. Writers like Francisco Pelsaert, Willem Piso, and Abel Tasman wrote about their travels in India, Brazil, and the East Indies, sharing their experiences with the Dutch public. Visual media also played a significant role in bringing the world to the Netherlands. Cartographers like Abraham Ortelius and Willem Jongzoon Bleu created detailed maps and atlases, which were sold in shops and hung in homes. Painters like Nicolaes Maes depicted scenes of global trade and commerce, such as The Account Keeper, showing a woman dozing while working on an account book, with a world map on the wall behind her. The Dutch didn't just import the world. They also sent people out to explore and settle in new lands. Thousands of Dutch administrators, mariners, merchants, soldiers, ministers, workers, and settlers ventured into the global sea lanes, establishing colonies in the East Indies, Ceylon, Brazil, New Netherland, and Suriname. They interacted with local populations in various ways, often through trade, conflict, and sometimes through marriage and cohabitation. These interactions left lasting cultural footprints in both the colonies and the Netherlands itself. Religion played a crucial role in these global connections. Calvinism. The dominant religion in the Dutch Republic spread alongside Dutch trade and colonization. Dutch ministers, known as predikanten, set up churches and schools in the colonies, seeking to convert local populations to the Reformed faith. By the late 17th century, there were hundreds of Calvinist churches and thousands of schoolchildren across the Dutch Empire, from the East Indies to South Africa. Despite the challenges of working in unfamiliar cultures, these ministers made significant efforts to educate and convert people, often working with local linguists to translate religious materials into native languages. The global reach of Dutch Calvinism influenced Dutch society in profound ways. Intellectuals like Hugo Grotius and Balthasar Bekker engaged with the broader world using their knowledge to challenge and expand the boundaries of religious thought. Grotius, in his work on the truth of the Christian religion, argued that well-ordered societies, whether pagan or Christian, could honor God. Bekker, in The Enchanted World, used global examples to challenge European superstitions and witchcraft beliefs. In this interconnected world, the Dutch Republic was not just a trading power, but a cultural and intellectual hub. The exchange of goods, ideas, and people transformed Dutch society, making it a true center of the early modern global network. The European world in the age of exploration was a time of great change and discovery. One of the most significant aspects of this era was the spread of Christianity, particularly Calvinism, across the globe. Calvinism, a form of Protestant Christianity, played a crucial role in how Europeans interacted with and understood the indigenous peoples they encountered in their travels. When European explorers and traders set out to distant lands, they brought with them not only their goods, but also their religious beliefs. The Dutch, known for their vast maritime empire, were especially active in this regard. Calvinist, clergy and laypeople traveled to places as far-flung as the Cape of Good Hope, Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, Brazil, and New Netherland, present-day New York. In these distant lands, they encountered a wide array of religious practices and cultural traditions, from traditional customs in Africa to the institutionalized religions of Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism in Asia. These encounters were not just one-way street conversions. The Calvinists who traveled abroad found themselves facing complex and challenging situations. They had to figure out how to interact with people whose beliefs and customs were vastly different from their own. This often led to deep reflections on their own faith and society. For example, when Calvinist missionaries tried to convert indigenous peoples, they had to decide how much of the local culture they could accept and how much they needed to change. This was a difficult balance, and it often led to debates and discussions both in the colonies and back in Europe. The impact of these global interactions on European society was profound. Historians have long recognized that the European Reformation and Enlightenment were not isolated events, but were deeply influenced by the wider world. The information and experiences that returned to Europe from these distant lands helped shape the way Europeans thought about religion, culture, and even science. One of the most significant examples of this is the book Religious Ceremonies of the World by Jean Frederick Bernard and Bernard Picquart. Published in the early 18th century, this book contained detailed descriptions and illustrations of religious practices from around the world. It was one of the first works to present different religions on equal terms, suggesting that all religions were worthy of respect and critical examination. This idea was revolutionary and had a lasting impact on European attitudes toward religious diversity. Another important aspect of this period was the way in which the Dutch trading companies, such as the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the Dutch West India Company, WIC, balanced their commercial interests with their religious aspirations. While the primary goal of these companies was to make a profit, they also saw spreading Protestant Christianity as part of their mission. This sometimes led to conflicts, but it also created opportunities for cultural exchange and understanding. For instance, in the Dutch colonies, Calvinist ministers and laypeople often worked closely with local communities. They established schools and churches, and sometimes even adapted their practices to better fit the local context. This was not always easy, and there were many challenges, but it led to a more nuanced and complex understanding of the world. The effects of these global interactions were not limited to the colonies. Back in Europe, the information and ideas that flowed in from the colonies influenced scholars, theologians, and naturalists. For example, the Dutch naturalist and physician who traveled to the East Indies brought back knowledge that helped shape the development of empirical science in Europe. This shows how the global reach of the Dutch Empire had a reciprocal impact, influencing both the colonies and the homeland. In the early modern period, the world was becoming more interconnected, and this had a significant impact on European history. The traditional view that the West dominated the world during this time has been challenged by historians who argue that European influence was often limited and that interactions with other cultures were more complex and reciprocal. For example, in Asia, the Datam dynasty in China and the Mughal Empire in India remained powerful and influential well into the 18th century. Even in the Americas, the story of European conquest and dominance is more nuanced, with local peoples playing significant roles in the colonial process. One of the key figures in understanding these global interactions is Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who wrote about the brutal treatment of indigenous peoples in the Americas. His work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, was one of the first to highlight the atrocities committed by European colonizers. This work, along with others, began to shift European attitudes toward their colonial endeavors, leading to a greater awareness of the moral implications of their actions. In recent years, historians have begun to explore these global interactions in more depth, using a variety of sources to paint a more comprehensive picture of the early modern world. Letters and reports from Calvinist ministers in the colonies, church records, and colonial documents all provide valuable insights into how Europeans and indigenous peoples interacted and how these interactions shaped both societies. For example, the correspondence between the regional church districts in the Netherlands and the Calvinist congregations abroad offers a window into the thoughts and concerns of these religious leaders. They wrote about their successes and failures, their struggles with local customs, and their efforts to convert and educate the indigenous peoples. These letters also reveal the ongoing conversations between the colonies and Europe, showing how ideas and information traveled back and forth across the oceans. In the end, the story of global Calvinism is a story of connection and exchange. It shows how the spread of Calvinist ideas and practices was not just a one-way process, but a dynamic and reciprocal interaction that had far-reaching effects on both the colonies and Europe. This perspective helps us understand the early modern period in a more nuanced and interconnected way, highlighting the complex and diverse nature of global history. In the 1560s, the Dutch provinces were part of the vast Spanish Empire, ruled by King Philip II. Philip wanted to control everything in his territories, including religion, politics, and money. This meant enforcing strict Catholicism, increasing taxes, and centralizing power. The Dutch, who were used to managing their own towns and provinces, didn't like these changes. They saw Philip's actions as a threat to their way of life and their freedoms. The tension boiled over in 1566 when a group of Dutch nobles, known as the Confederates, presented a petition to the Spanish governor, Margaret of Parma, demanding religious tolerance and an end to the harsh policies. When their demands were ignored, the situation escalated. In 1568, a full-scale rebellion began, led by William of Orange, who became known as William the Silent. William, a Protestant, saw the rebellion as a fight for both political and religious freedom. The Dutch revolt was not just a fight against Spanish rule, it was also a religious reformation. Many Dutch people had already converted to Calvinism, a form of Protestantism that emphasized a strict moral code and the idea that God had a plan for the world. Calvinists believed that the Catholic Church was corrupt and that it needed to be reformed. They saw the Spanish as not only political oppressors, but also as religious enemies. This religious fervor fueled the rebellion and gave it a strong moral purpose. The war against Spain lasted for decades, and it was brutal. The Spanish army was well trained and well equipped, but the Dutch had something that the Spanish didn't: a deep sense of purpose and a strong network of support. Merchants, farmers, and ordinary people all contributed to the war effort. Dutch cities like Amsterdam and Leiden became centers of resistance, and their ports became crucial for smuggling weapons and supplies. During this time, the Dutch also began to look outward, beyond their own borders. They saw the Spanish and Portuguese empires as not just political rivals, but also as religious ones. The Spanish and Portuguese were spreading Catholicism around the world, and the Dutch saw this as a threat to their own religious beliefs. They decided to challenge the Iberian powers by establishing their own maritime empire. In 1596, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, was formed, followed by the West India Company, WIC, in 1621. These companies were not just about making money. They were also about spreading Calvinism. The VOC and WIC sent ships to explore new lands, establish trade routes, and set up colonies. They saw these missions as part of a larger divine plan to spread the true Christian faith and counter the influence of Catholicism. The Dutch approach to empire was different from that of the Spanish and Portuguese. Instead of focusing on conquering large territories, they concentrated on establishing trading posts and forming alliances with local rulers. They also brought their religious beliefs with them, but they were more flexible in how they approached conversion. While they believed that everyone should eventually become a Calvinist, they were willing to work with local people and even incorporate some of their customs into their own practices. The Dutch merchants and ministers who traveled to these new lands faced many challenges. They had to navigate complex political situations, deal with different cultures, and sometimes use force to protect their interests. But they also saw these missions as a way to fulfill their religious and moral obligations. They believed that God had a plan for them, and that by spreading Calvinism, they were playing a part in that plan. The early years of the Dutch Empire were marked by both success and conflict. The Dutch established important trading posts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and they began to build a network of colonies. However, they also faced resistance from local people and other European powers. The Dutch had to be adaptable and resourceful, and they often used a combination of diplomacy, trade, and military force to achieve their goals. The Dutch Republic that emerged from this period was a unique combination of a commercial power and a religious state. The merchants, who controlled the economy and the government, were also deeply committed to Calvinism. They saw their success in trade and empire as a sign of God's favor, and they believed that their wealth and power were meant to be used for the greater good. As the Dutch expanded their reach around the world, they brought their Calvinist beliefs with them. They established churches, schools, and missions in their colonies, and they worked to convert local people to their faith. But they also had to deal with the complexities of interacting with different cultures and the ethical questions that arose from their empire-building activities. The Dutch Republic's rise to power in the 17th century was not just a story of economic success. It was also a story of religious conviction and moral purpose. The Dutch saw their empire as part of a larger mission to spread their faith and to build a world that reflected their values. This unique blend of commerce, religion, and empire would shape the Dutch Republic for generations to come. In the 1560s, a group of people called Calvinists, who followed the teachings of John Calvin, started spreading their ideas across the Dutch provinces. They held open-air sermons and preached a strong belief in God's control over salvation, strict moral rules, and a rejection of the Catholic Church's practices. The Calvinists were a small group, but they were very passionate and vocal. King Philip II of Spain, who ruled over the Netherlands, did not like these ideas. He thought they were dangerous and could cause unrest. To stop the Calvinists, he increased the number of bishops and inquisitors in the Netherlands. This made the Dutch nobles and city leaders very unhappy because they felt their local rights were being violated. Even though most Dutch people were not Calvinists, they disliked the harsh measures taken by the Spanish authorities. The tension grew, and in 1566, some Dutch nobles formed a group called the Beggars, led by Willem of Orange. They opposed the Spanish rule and were supported by many Calvinists. For 6 years, from 1566 to 1572, the Beggars fought against the Spanish. They destroyed Catholic images and statues, faced harsh punishments, and had to pay heavy taxes. In 1572, they won a significant victory by taking control of many cities in Holland. The conflict continued, and in 1579, the northern 7 provinces signed the Union of Utrecht, declaring their independence from Spain. The Calvinist Church became the official church in Holland and Zeeland, and other provinces followed. However, even though the Reformed Church was the main church, the Union of Utrecht also guaranteed freedom of conscience. This meant that people could believe what they wanted, but they couldn't openly practice other religions. Catholics, in particular, were seen as a threat and faced penalties. During this time, Dutch merchants in Holland and Zeeland saw an opportunity to expand their trade. The war with Spain disrupted trade routes, especially when the Beggars blockaded the Scheldt River, cutting off Antwerp from international trade. This was a big blow to Antwerp, and Amsterdam began to grow as a major trading hub. Dutch merchants started trading luxury goods like olive oil, wine, and spices from the Mediterranean. They also tried to find new ways to get spices directly from their sources in Asia. Calvinist leaders and merchants worked together to support these efforts. They believed that spreading their faith and expanding trade were linked. This led to the formation of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1602. The VOC was given a monopoly on trade in Asia and the right to build forts, raise armies, and make treaties. The company quickly became a powerful force in the East Indies, controlling trade in spices like nutmeg, mace, and cloves. The VOC's leaders, like Jan Pieter Zuynkowin, believed that trade and war were closely connected. They used military force to secure control over key trading areas, sometimes using violent methods. For example, in 1621, Cohen led an invasion of the Banda Islands, killing many native inhabitants and importing slaves to work on spice plantations. This aggressive approach helped the Dutch establish a strong commercial empire in Asia. The Dutch also formed the West India Company, YC, in 1621 to expand their trade and influence in the Atlantic. This company focused on trade in West Africa, the Caribbean, and South America. The WIC played a crucial role in the Dutch maritime empire, which stretched across both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Back in the Netherlands, Calvinism continued to shape society and culture. The Calvinist Church had a significant influence, and its leaders worked closely with the government to promote their beliefs. However, The guarantee of freedom of conscience meant that people could still hold different religious views, even if they couldn't openly practice them. By the early 1620s, the Dutch had built a powerful commercial empire, with the VOC and WIC at its core. This empire was driven by a combination of religious conviction, commercial ambition, and military strength. The Dutch became major players in the global trade of the time, and their influence extended from Europe to Asia and the Americas. The Dutch were building a vast empire in the 1600s, reaching out to Asia and the Atlantic. They set up trading posts and colonies, but they also brought their religion with them. This religion, known as Calvinism, was a strict form of Protestant Christianity that had become very important in the Netherlands by the 1620s. The Dutch wanted to spread their faith as much as they wanted to trade spices and other goods. In the Netherlands, the church and state worked together closely. The Dutch had just won their independence from Spain, and the Reformed Church, which followed Calvinist teachings, became the official church. The church was organized into groups called consistories, which were like small councils that managed church affairs and made sure people followed the rules. These consistories were part of larger groups called classes, which in turn were part of even larger groups called synods. The biggest group was the National Synod, which was like a big meeting of all the church leaders. However, not everyone agreed on exactly how Calvinist teachings should be interpreted. Two important thinkers, Jacob Arminius and Francis Gomarius, had a big disagreement. Arminius thought that people had some control over their own salvation, while Gomarius believed that God had already decided who would be saved and who would not. This argument got very heated, and even involved the government. Prince Maurits, who was like a king in the Netherlands, called a big meeting called the Synod of Dort in 1618 to resolve the dispute. The synod decided that Gomarius was right, and his followers, called counter-remonstrants, became the official church leaders. Those who agreed with Arminius, called remonstrants, were punished and sometimes even forced to leave the country. This strict Calvinist church influenced how the Dutch approached their empire. They wanted to spread their religion to the people they encountered in Asia and the Americas. Theologians like Gisbertus Voetius and Johannes Hoornbeek wrote about the importance of missions and trained students to become missionaries. These missionaries tried to teach people about Christianity and translate religious texts into local languages. They built schools and educated both children and adults. When the Dutch East India Company, VOC, first started trading in Asia, they sent ministers and comforters of the sick to places like the Moluccas and Java. These early missionaries had a tough job. Many of the people they met had already been baptized by Catholic missionaries, and the Dutch wanted to convert them to Protestantism. The VOC governors also wanted to make sure that local people remained loyal to the company. They often had to balance their religious goals with the need to maintain good trade relations. Sometimes, the VOC made agreements with local rulers that allowed people to practice their own religions. For example, in the Moluccas, the Dutch agreed not to try to convert the locals to Christianity. In Japan, the VOC even agreed to ban all Christian symbols and activities to maintain good relations with the shogun. This was a difficult compromise for the missionaries, but the VOC believed it was necessary for their business. By the 1620s, the Dutch had established a strong presence in key areas, like the Moluccas and Jakarta. They saw their success as a sign of God's favor and believed that spreading Christianity was part of their mission. The Dutch Empire continued to grow, and missions became an important part of their colonial society. Despite the challenges, the Dutch remained committed to their religious and commercial goals, shaping the world in ways that are still felt today. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was a powerful trading company that shaped the way goods and ideas moved across the Indian Ocean and beyond. The company's journey began in Batavia, now known as Jakarta, where governor-generals like Jan Pieter Zeun Cohen laid the groundwork for a vast trading network. Cohen's vision was to create a system where the VOC could control the flow of valuable goods like spices, textiles, and silver. To achieve this, the VOC set up trading posts in key locations. When the English and Persians forced the Portuguese out of Hormuz in 1622, the VOC quickly moved in. They opened a trading station there and an office in Isfahan, a major city in Persia. This allowed the VOC to become the main carrier of Persian goods like silk and carpets to markets in Asia. In South Asia, the VOC built trading posts in places like Masalipatnam and Pulicat and expanded their reach up the coast to Bengal. They even formed an alliance with the King of Kandy in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to fight against the Portuguese. By 1658, the VOC had completely expelled the Portuguese from Ceylon, giving them a strong foothold in the region. The VOC's strategy wasn't just about setting up trading posts. They also used military force to secure their positions. The company's governor, Ryclof van Goens, built fortifications and a small colony at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. This place served as a stopover for Dutch ships traveling between the Netherlands and Asia. The VOC also tried to establish a presence in China and Japan. They took control of Formosa, now Taiwan, in 1624 and gained exclusive trading rights in Japan by 1640. This allowed them to trade Japanese silver for Chinese goods like silk and porcelain. The VOC's trading network was complex. They would exchange Chinese goods for Japanese silver, use the silver to buy more Chinese items, and then trade these with places like Gujarat and the Coromandel coast in India for cotton textiles. These textiles were then traded for spices in places like Banten and the Banda Islands. This cycle of trade made the VOC one of the most profitable companies in the world during the 17th century. However, the VOC's success was built on a foundation of armed mercantilism. They had a large military force, including ships, troops, and forts, which they used to fight rivals like the Portuguese and Spanish. Between 1605 and 1663, the VOC won many battles against the Portuguese, taking over important places like Malacca, Cochin, and even replacing the Spanish in Ternate and Tidore. The Portuguese managed to hold on to some areas, like Mozambique and Macau, but their empire in Asia was in decline. The VOC's success also relied on a diverse workforce. Many of the people who worked for the company were enslaved, coming from places like Eastern Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The company also brought in Chinese migrants to help with trade and labor. Despite the company's efforts to create settler colonies, few Europeans were willing to move to these tropical lands. Instead, the colonies were made up of a mix of Europeans, Eurasians, Asians, and Africans. The VOC also had a significant impact on religion. In the 1620s, the company and the church began to work together to convert local populations to Calvinism, a form of Protestant Christianity. They set up schools, translated religious texts, and tried to ban non-Christian practices. However, the process of conversion was slow and often met with resistance. Missionaries faced challenges, and the growth of Calvinist communities was uneven. The Dutch also expanded their influence in the Atlantic through the West India Company, WIC. Like the VOC, the WIC aimed to create a network of trading posts and colonies. They attacked Portuguese and Spanish holdings, taking control of places like Elmina on the Gold Coast and parts of Brazil. The WIC also established a trading post in New Amsterdam, which later became New York City. However, the WIC faced similar challenges to the VOC in terms of attracting settlers and managing a diverse population. The VOC and WIC were not just trading companies. They were also instruments of empire. Their actions reshaped the world, creating a global network of trade and influence that lasted for centuries. The legacy of these companies can still be seen in the cultural and economic ties that exist between different parts of the world today. The Dutch dream of building a vast empire in the Atlantic was both grand and ambitious. In the 1630s and 1640s, Brazil stood at the heart of this dream. Johan Maurits of Siegen-Nassau, the Dutch governor, led the colony from 1637 to 1644, and under his rule, the Dutch West India Company, WIC, flourished. Maurits attracted artists, naturalists, and financiers to Brazil, hoping to create a thriving Calvinist community. He even allowed Catholics to practice their religion publicly, which was a bold move for a Protestant leader. However, he banned some religious orders, like the Jesuits, Benedictines, Carmelites, and Franciscans, in 1640. To encourage Sephardic Jews to finance sugar and slave operations, Maurits permitted them to worship openly. This pleased the Jews, but upset the Calvinist ministers who wanted Brazil to be a purely Protestant land. The WIC's success in Brazil was tied to its trade network. Ships from Amsterdam brought manufactured goods to West Africa, where they traded for slaves. These slaves were then sent to Brazil to work on sugar plantations. The sugar, molasses, and Brazil wood produced in Brazil were shipped back to the Netherlands. The WIC also expanded its control over the Guinea coast, becoming a major player in the Atlantic slave trade. Between 1636 and 1645, the WIC transported over 23,000 slaves from West Africa to Brazil. During this period, sugar production in Brazil increased significantly, with the number of sugar refineries almost doubling. The WIC's vision included not just trade, but also spreading the Calvinist faith. Leaders like de Laet saw the company as a means to attack Catholic Spain and Portugal, and to spread the true religion. Many WIC officials were also Calvinist elders, and they believed that commerce and missionary work went hand in hand. Ministers like Willem Tillink and Godefridus Udemans preached about the opportunities for both profit and conversion in the Atlantic. In Brazil, Dutch Calvinist ministers set up churches, schools, and translation projects aiming to convert the local population, including Portuguese, Luso-Brazilians, indigenous Tupi, and enslaved Africans. However, the Dutch dream in the Atlantic faced significant challenges. The WIC struggled to maintain control over its trade routes, as other European powers, including the Spanish, Portuguese, and English, were also active in the region. In 1644, Johan Maurits was recalled to the Netherlands, and Dutch rule in Brazil began to unravel. Planters in Pernambuco, resentful of Dutch control and the influx of Sephardic Jews, staged a rebellion in 1645. By 1653, the Dutch had lost control of Brazil, signaling the end of their colonial ambitions there. The loss of Brazil was a severe blow to the WIC, which had relied heavily on sugar production and the slave trade for profits. The company's shares on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange plummeted and bankruptcy loomed. In the decades that followed, the WIC had to adapt. The company shifted from a colonial power to a specialized trading entity, serving European colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean. The Dutch also focused on the carrying trade, transporting slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean and South America. By the 1660s, the WIC and private Dutch merchants were significant players in the slave trade, despite the challenges posed by the English, who imposed navigation acts to restrict Dutch trade. The English posed a serious threat to Dutch commerce, leading to several naval wars between 1651 and 1674. These wars, along with the invasion of the United Provinces by French and English forces in 1672, dealt a severe blow to Dutch shipping and trade. Despite these challenges, the Dutch managed to survive, but their colonial and commercial dreams in the Atlantic were largely over. In Asia, the Dutch East India Company, BOC, continued to thrive. Under leaders like Joan Mat-Suijger and Ryclof van Goens, the VOC expanded its military capabilities and retained its dominant position in the Indian Ocean. The company faced competition from the English and French, but it successfully defended its territories and trade routes. The Dutch Calvinist presence in the Atlantic colonies, including Brazil, New Netherland, and Suriname, declined rapidly after the loss of Brazil. Few ministers showed interest in converting indigenous peoples or African slaves, and many Dutch settlements were sparsely populated. The focus of Dutch ministers in these colonies often shifted to staunching defections to other Protestant denominations. In the end, the Dutch Atlantic dream of a vast empire and a strong Calvinist presence was a fleeting one. The WIC's failure in Brazil and the challenges posed by other European powers marked a turning point. The Dutch had to adapt to a new reality, focusing on trade rather than territorial control. The legacy of this period, however, remains a significant chapter in the history of the Atlantic world, reflecting the complex interplay of commerce, religion, and colonial ambitions.